Hi class, this will be our last video for this class, and as promised I'm going to follow up with the review of some of the citation information that you're going to need to know for this paper and that you'll use in future classes. So both of these paragraphs are from a paper that I wrote several years ago, or maybe a couple of years ago anyway, about a book called Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And I'll go ahead and read this first sentence to you. It says, "In the last several years, a number of scholars have discussed different theories of time and the way that Mrs. Dalloway becomes a revolt against externally imposed constructs, including men's time, Culkin 348, Greenwich time, which becomes a symbol of imperial power and commercial manipulation, Barrow's 278, and Cambridge time, which is associated with abstract continuity, Banfield 486. So, as you can see, this might actually, I think this particular sentence was early in my paper, and it may have even been part of my thesis, or some part of the explanation of my thesis, like maybe my background information section or something. But here I am talking about the issue of time in this book, and I'm saying scholars have given 3 different perspectives on this, and they're all different. Men's time from Culkin, Greenwich time from Barrows, and Cambridge time from Banfield. And the reason that all of the author's last names appear in the parentheses here are because I didn't actually mention them in my text. So I'm quoting something, but since I haven't formally introduced the author, I need to include the author here and the page number, because I want, if one of my readers says, wow, that's really interesting, I'd like to read more about that, I want them to be able to know where to go. And also, I need to follow copyright information. I can't just use other people's ideas as my own, right? So that's why I did that in this paragraph. In this next paragraph, which did not in the paper actually come right after this one, it says, as he explains in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence has 3 main postulates. First, that in eternal time, whatever can happen has already happened an infinite number of times and will continue to recur infinitely. And that happened in a book by Nietzsche, page 156. Second, that for the mind there is no outside, page 217 of the mind. And third, that the only way to overcome the inevitability of death is through amor fati, which means love of fate, and can be described as the absolute acceptance of existence and the ability to find redemption and life as lived. So in this paragraph, I actually did mention Nietzsche here, so I probably didn't even need to include his last name in that citation, but I went ahead and did it anyway, and that is fine. But after that, I'm still talking about Nietzsche's book. I haven't changed to a different source. So after his name appears the first time, I don't have to put his name again, because my reader will automatically assume that any page number that comes after this first one is from the same source. So if in your paper you're talking about a single source and you give several different quotes from that source within a single paragraph, you can, or even if it extends to 2 paragraphs, you can just write the page number, unless you mention a different source or a different person's name. The whole goal here is just to make it very clear for your reader who you are citing. The other thing I want to point out that I've talked about before in a video, or maybe it was just in a PowerPoint, but either way, it has come up before in this class, is that I didn't give long extended quotes from the text. I only used the words that were most important. So I only quoted the very most important things, and then the rest I paraphrased. It was my own words, and I am explaining what these things are. And you can also see that each of these things, I'm fitting into my ideas. I'm fitting them into my paper as my own topic. So I'm not doing just a big summary of one person's idea and then a big summary of somebody else's. I'm actually taking time to think through and say, how do these fit together? And that is something you are absolutely going to have to do in your paper as well. You may not have a single sentence that's exactly like this, although some of you probably will, where you include 3 different authors in one sentence. But I expect to see sentences where you're explaining how one perspective relates to a different perspective. Explaining, just as we did with our summary and connection essays, how are these 2 things different, or how are they similar? How does one build on the other? Or how does one call into question something that the other has said? Another quick review: as you're working or reworking your conclusion, make sure that you do these things. Make an obvious transition so I know you're moving into your conclusion. Restate your main point. Re-emphasize the importance of the subject, so this is how you'll connect with your audience. And then look to the future. So what are the implications of your argument? What if your audience accepts your conclusions, what will happen? So these are kind of the things that you should do in your conclusion. You can read more about or you can learn more about conclusions if you look at some of our previous PowerPoints and videos. And some last minute revision tips, because you'll just be working on your revision this week. One of the things that I have found really helpful is I like to read my paper out loud to somebody else, because when we read silently, or even sometimes if we're just reading out loud to ourselves, we will not really think about what we're reading. But if we're reading to somebody else or having them read to us, which can sometimes be uncomfortable, but it's a good revision exercise, we get really concerned that they are understanding what we were trying to say. And so when you read it out loud to somebody else, you will find yourself changing a sentence as you read. If you do that, write it down so you can actually change it the way you wrote it. And you will sometimes get to the end of a paragraph and be like, are you with me on that? Did that make sense to you? And if you find yourself doing that, that is a signal that there's something wrong. The other thing with reading out loud is down to like the stylistic sentence level. As you're reading out loud, if you stumble over words or a certain phrase, a lot of times that is because there's an error there, because you speak English fluently. Sometimes we don't write as fluently as we speak. And so when we're reading something out loud and it just doesn't come out right, we have a hard time saying it. A lot of the time it's because we need to fix something in our grammar or something in our style so that it flows better. So that is a really good strategy for revision. Another thing that I have to do in my revision is I have to take a break. I can't go straight into revision like a day after I finish my draft. I like to finish my draft 3 to 5 days or even more, depending on how big the paper is, before I start revising. And for me, that is because I work really hard when I write a draft, and sometimes I really struggled through some of my sentences. And so when I'm revising them, I think to myself, oh, I worked so hard on that. I just loved that sentence. And so even if the idea was bad, I always try and keep the sentence, which is bad idea. And so that's why if I take a little bit of time between, then I've forgotten some of the pain of the first writing, and I feel a lot more comfortable just changing things. It's easier for me to let go of what I already wrote. I can recognize it as bad, or I can recognize that it needs improvement because time has passed. And then the other thing that I want to remind you of is don't be afraid of doing substantive revisions. By substantive revisions, I mean don't be afraid to change big things like your organization or some of the content. If you read through and you're like, man, this paragraph it really doesn't go with all the rest of my paper. It's really a stretch to fit this one in here. Take it out. This was a study, I should have pulled it out before I started making this video, but there was a study done a few years ago, and what they found is amateur writers, so beginner writers, usually saw revision as just fixing the words. So they saw it as changing the style, just making the style better, whereas expert writers usually saw revision as a chance to rethink what they were doing. A lot of times you'll hear in a writing class people say revision because you see you have vision, so you see your writing in a different way. And so as you're revising, you can be doing a lot of changes to the way your paper works. And if you get to the point where you are doing that, that's actually a sign that you're becoming a lot more advanced in your writing technique. So don't be afraid to do that kind of change as you're doing your revision. That's actually why I have you turn a rough draft in 2 weeks before you have to turn in your final copy, because it gives you the chance to do all of these revision things that I'm asking you to do. And the last thing I think that you might find very helpful as you're revising is I want you to know the things that are most important to me for your paper. So the very first thing is your topic. Did you identify a current issue or conversation and explain the different perspectives in an educated and unbiased way? So if this looks like a persuasive paper, that is not what I'm looking for, and that is like a really big mark against you. The second thing, did you do good research? Did you use the correct number of sources, and do you integrate them well? Do you fully explain how each of your sources relate to the others? And that is your logos. So do you use good logos? Do you use a strong arc of thought as you put things together? The third thing I look for is organization. And this one is also really important. Even though it's below the other two, this is kind of one of my personal favorite important things. So to me, organization is really important in a paper. Did you follow the old new contract? Do you transition well between paragraphs? But also, does it make sense that you ordered each paragraph the way you did? Would a different kind of organization be better for this paper? Did you group all of your similar topics into one section of your paper and group other ones into a different section? And then do you have a really strong transition explaining what you're doing at all points of your paper, so I don't have to figure it out as a reader? And then the last thing is style. Is your paper easy to read and free from errors? Do you use correct MLA formatting? Do you establish strong ethos by using active and interesting language? So this is also very important. Obviously, it's one of the top 4, but it's also the last of the top 4. So as you're doing your revision, look at the first 3. Try and fix the first 3 before you work on style. But if you feel very good about those first 3, please improve your style. Look for stronger words to use. Look for more beautiful language that you can incorporate. These are things that will make your paper a lot better and that will help you become a better writer as you look forward to future classes. So, in conclusion, I have really enjoyed teaching you this semester and getting to know a lot of you through your posts, emails, and conferences. And I wish you luck as you move forward in your classes. And as you continue as a writer. Thank you very much.